Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Shays, for powerful remarks, for your enormous concern about an issue that is deeply personal for me. As a woman member of this House, as someone who has focused her entire career here on protecting the security of the United States of America, it is galling and enormously upsetting to think that the personal security of the women who fight for our flag is at risk. As you mentioned, I spent 6 years here serving on the Armed Services Committee, where I was on a 3-person task force investigating sexual harassment against women in the military. I spent 8 years on the Intelligence Committee. I spent 4 years on the Homeland Security Committee, where I chair the Intelligence Subcommittee. And these issues are never far from my personal priority list. 60 years have passed since President Truman issued his historic order ending racial segregation in the military. Here in Congress, we recently commemorated this milestone with Defense Secretary Robert Gates and former Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Colin Powell. Speaking at the event, Secretary Powell, who joined the Army just 10 years after Truman's orders, said, "They no longer cared whether I was black or white, immigrant or not. His commanders," he said, asked him only one question: can you perform? And as we all know, he did. Perhaps less well known is that the same year, Truman also signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act into law, landmark legislation that allowed women to serve permanently in the armed forces. And we have. But as noteworthy as this event was, the progress it represented on paper, the progress for women it represented on paper, is still in many important respects, it eludes us. And I want to focus today, as you are and as this hearing is, on a major problem, which is rape and sexual assault in the military, and the bipartisan legislation that Mike Turner, a member of your panel, who's sitting right here, and I'm pleased to see you, Mike, and I have introduced, H-Con Res 397, which is intended to halt the epidemic of assault and rape against women in our military. The stories are shocking in their simplicity and brutality. A female military recruit is pinned down at knife point and raped repeatedly in her barracks. Though her attackers hid their faces, she identified them by their uniforms. They were her fellow soldiers. During a routine gynecological exam, a female soldier is attacked and raped by her military physician. Yet another young soldier, still adapting to life in a war zone, is raped by her commanding officer. Afraid for her standing in her unit, she feels she has nowhere to turn. These stories are sadly not isolated events. Women serving in the U.S. military today are more likely to be raped by a fellow soldier than killed by enemy fire in Iraq. Let me say that again. Women serving in the U.S. military today are more likely to be raped by a fellow soldier than killed by enemy fire in Iraq. The scope of the problem was brought into acute focus for me during a visit to the West Los Angeles VA Health Center, where I met female veterans and their doctors. My jaw dropped when the doctors told me that 41% of the female veterans seen there say they were victims of sexual assault while serving in the military. 29% say they were raped during their military service. They spoke of their continued terror, feelings of helplessness, and downward spirals many of their lives have taken since. Just the kind of story that Louise Slaughter just described. Numbers reported by the Department of Defense show the same sickening pattern. In 2006, 2,947 sexual assaults were reported, 73% more than in 2004. The DoD's most recent report, released earlier this summer, indicates that 2,688 reports were made in 2007. But a recent shift, as you've heard, from calendar year reporting to fiscal year reporting makes comparisons with data from previous years much more difficult. The Pentagon has made some efforts to manage this epidemic, most notably in 2005, after the media received anonymous email messages about sexual assaults at the Air Force Academy. The press scrutiny and congressional attention, and I thank you for that, which followed, led DoD to create the Sexual Assault and Response Office, SAPRO, Since its inception, SAPRO has initiated training and improved reporting of rapes and sexual assaults, but has failed to track prosecution rates or how witnesses are faring within the military structure. I can tell you how they're faring, and it's not a happy story. At the heart of this crisis is an apparent inability or unwillingness to prosecute rapists in the ranks. According to DOD's own statistics, a mere 181 out of 2,212 subjects, or 8%, investigated for sexual assaults in 2007, including over 1,200 reports of rape, were referred to courts-martial. In nearly half the cases investigated, the chain of command took no action, and in the majority of those that were acted upon, the offenders were assigned administrative or non-judicial punishment. As Chairman Waxman just said, in most cases that meant a slap on the wrist. In more than one-third of the cases that were not pursued, the commander took no action because of, quote, insufficient evidence. This is in stark contrast to the civil justice system, where 40% of those arrested for rape are prosecuted, according to Department of Justice and FBI figures. The DOD must close this gap and remove the obstacles to effective investigation and prosecution. Failure to draw bright red lines produces two harmful consequences. First, it deters victims from reporting rapes, and it fails to deter offenders. But second of all, it perpetuates the attitude, which all of us should condemn, that boys will be boys. The legislation that Mr. Turner and I have introduced calls on the Secretary of Defense to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to end assault and rape in the military, to encourage and increase investigations and prosecutions. It also urges the Secretary to provide better protection for victims from their alleged attackers after reporting a sexual assault or rape. I have raised this issue, Mr. Chairman, personally with Secretary of Defense Gates, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, our former colleague, Army Secretary Pete Guerin, among others. While they express real concern, and I believe that Pete Guerin is going to make this a major focus of his tenure as Secretary of the Army, and I commend him for this, much, 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 much more needs to be done. And Congress must do better, too. While these sexual assault statistics are readily available, our oversight has yet to come to grips with an effective answer to solve the problem. No doubt the abhorrent and graphic nature of the reports makes people uncomfortable, but this is no excuse. And I applaud you, and I applaud Mr. Shays for shining a light on this problem and focusing. Let me just conclude with this. Most of our service women and men are patriotic, courageous, and hardworking people who embody the best of what it means to be an American. The failure to stem sexual assault and rape in the military runs counter to those ideals and shames us all. Thank you.